Good day and welcome back to another Dbz Dokkan battle video. In this video we are going to be taking a look at ranking the hardest Redzone bosses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the beginning for all the Redzone bosses basically and just slowly rank them all and then start obviously slotting them down as they kind of go along. So basically we're going to take a look at everything and then rank them based on how hard I found them. We'll see how things go, but I think that most people will generally agree on my consensus, I guess. So obviously, first things first, we'll start with the movie bosses and then kind of move on. So we have Turles. So the first fight against Turles isn't too bad. For the most part, the first phase you fight multiple enemies, you fight 5 of them. They each have around 5 to 6 million health, which isn't too bad. Their super attacks do around 250 to 300,000 damage, and generally speaking there's not anything too gimmicky. You can stun them, you can seal them, so there's generally a pretty good level of control around that first portion of the fight. Typing wise, they cover typings pretty well, but tech units generally seem to be okay for the first round, but then obviously you're facing an int Turles in the final round, so there's no favorable typing really. There's only one strength enemy, but there's a second strength phase. Generally speaking, it feels like AGL is okay in this phase, because once you get past the first phase of 2 tech enemies, you're generally fine. Turles isn't the worst or easiest boss across the board, but he's definitely not the hardest. I would honestly say that he's average, generally speaking. So I'm gonna stick him in around 8th, and you'll see we'll slot people in as we go along. But we'll start him out at 8th, but potentially he's probably going to end up at 9, so we'll actually just leave him there. The next one we're going to look at is going to be on the GT side, so we're going to alternate as much as we can. So Legic is 1 phase only. He fires a couple attacks during a turn, he has a bit of dodge, but generally speaking he's not really anything too crazy. His attacks hit for roughly 500,000, I believe. So generally speaking, he's not like the hardest unit to kind of take on. I think he's also the easiest because he only has 1 typing, which makes him a little bit, I don't know, I want to say simple, easy to plan for. So Legic is definitely by far the easiest. 1 single typing, no real gimmicks to him. In terms of strategy, he's immune to stunning, immune to sealing, but there's that's standard stuff for bosses nowadays in most content. So personally speaking, I think he's really not that difficult, and I think he's okay. He's really, like, how do I say, he could be someone that's quite difficult, but I think if you've got a decent tech team, you're not going to struggle. Next we have Lord Slug. Again, very similar to Turles in like essence of the unit. He's obviously got like quite a few, I want to say, token threats about him. So his first units in the first phase hit a little bit harder than Turles's, but there are less of them. There's only 3 of them, and they have slightly more health. They work out to being actually easier overall, because there's less of them, they have less total health, and their typings are a bit more favorable. Only AGL, int, and physical here. The next phase is also physical, and the final phase is strength. So you can run a pretty AGL heavy team and get through this fight not too badly. Once you get to the second phase, he starts to regen health, which is a little bit annoying, but isn't the worst mechanic in the game. At least for me, I don't find it to be the worst mechanic in the game. And yeah, overall, you know, he does 562,000 attack damage with his second phase and 756, which is pretty heavy in his third phase. So he starts to ramp up the difficulty a little bit. I think the favorable typing doesn't make him as hard as he wants to be. And personally speaking, I think you can actually get around it quite a bit. So I think for the most part, I'm gonna say he's really not that bad. And I'm probably gonna slot him in at 8th. Like, the favorable typings gives you a good advantage. And although he does hit pretty hard, honestly speaking, it's not the worst in the world. And I just think, yeah, he's quite manageable. He can be irritating with the heals, but yeah, generally speaking, he can be pretty manageable overall. So then we have Lud next. And yeah, Lud. Well, Lud is an interesting one because his first phase is relatively chilled, I want to say. He hits for 526,000 damage, which doesn't seem like that much. But he does lower your defense, which can be quite frustrating. And can cause a lot of units problems because lowering defense for 40% for 3 turns does generally cause a lot of raw defense units, quite a few issues. Not to mention, he also obviously is quite tanky. 21 million health is quite considerable. It's also substantially more than the other bosses have, like neither Lord Slug nor Turles had 21 million in the first phase. And he's got even more health in the second phase. So Lud does get, harder. He also hits harder in the second phase, 550,000 damage, but he also does more damage, like in general, because he raises his attack by 30% every time he supers. So that's something that can make him hit quite hard. I think his typings are also quite favorable. I could place either of them interchangeably with each other, but both of them have a very similar thing about them in that they are very susceptible to type-based builds. Like, building an AGL team lets you really handle the final phase of both fights pretty well, especially if your team can get through the initial fight. So I think for me, those kind of red zone bosses, and you'll see them appear later on as well, those red zone bosses are quite greatly diminished for me, just in terms of overall difficulty. And I think a lot of people may not agree with it, but I genuinely think it is a little bit, it's a little bit of a kind of a gimmick, I want to say, to build around it, but it is what it is. So then we have movie bosses again, and we've got Kula. So Kula is kind of following the trend, obviously, of having the minions first. It's kind of a theme with the movie bosses ones for a while. And with Kula, you start out against quite strong enemies. They're physical, tech, and AGL types. They all hit very similarly in difficulty to the Lord Slug event, so they're not that much harder than that. What's interesting about this is that they have the AGL type unit to counter strength type units, but again, you could build a strength team here and handle this event pretty well. Kula himself does hit harder than Lord Slug. So Kula, in his second phase, he hits harder than Lord Slug. Second phase, he also has more health. He's a little bit tougher, and then also in the third phase he's got more health, hits a little bit harder. The thing about Kula that I'm going to say, and a lot of people may not agree with it, but Kula has the countdown mechanic, and the countdown mechanic does kind of help you in a sense. So Kula does a huge amount of damage. I think it's 900 and it's close to 1 million with his super attack. And although it's obviously very difficult, if you have a strength unit, you do immediately reduce that quite substantially. And Cooler for me, yeah, immediately kind of loses a little bit of that fear factor when you have the ability to see where obviously he's launching that attack. Obviously in the beginning phase, the cool thing is you can obviously stun and control that phase, which is always nice. And then from the rest of the phases, it's all stock standard stuff really. Cooler, I'm going to put in 6th position, and he's probably not going to move from there. Just because, yeah, overall, he's not generally like, you know, the hardest boss in the world. I want to put it in that sense. We'll be shifting things around here. Obviously, probably need to add more categories, I guess, which would probably help. But hey, but yeah. So yeah, we're gonna have to, yeah, kind of add a few more categories here, I think, or tie some bosses up. I think right now I would probably say that Lud and Lord Slug are on the same level of difficulty, and that Cooler is probably here. I think, yeah, Cooler, the ability to see where his super attack is coming made him relatively simple for the most part. And like I said, once you get past the first AGL enemy, generally all strength teams, or mainly strength focused teams, have a decent time, and you have pretty good options with the team. So then we move on to GT, and then we have Baby. Now Baby is where I think a lot of players struggle. So Baby as a unit, or sorry, we're up to General Rildo. Just skipped old General Rildo then. Yeah, General Rildo is pretty tough. He actually did cause me a couple problems. So his big thing, or General Rildo's big thing, is that he lowers defense in every single phase. This is an absolute bastard maneuver because it really causes havoc with a lot of teams that rely on raw defense. So teams like the Ginyu team, for example, where I have a ton of units that raise their defense and obviously get stronger. That lowering of defense, when you have a whole bunch of other mechanics, kind of causes you issues. Evasion teams generally do well, but I think what they do really nice, I think what they do well, like with Rildo, that they don't do with some of the other fights, is they do his typings quite well. The first phase is int, which means generally, and this next phase is AGL, and then the final phase is tech. So obviously the counter to tech is to bring int. Obviously there's no straight direct weakness to int units, but there is a nice widespread diversity to the challenge, and generally speaking Rildo has quite solid, I want to say, stats across the board. Each phase is individually quite a challenge as a unit, and that massively lowering defense can kind of carry over and cause you quite a few issues. 20 million, 24 million, 28 million health respectively. SA damage isn't high, it's not as high as Cooler, for example. But yeah, it's definitely quite a step up there, and I think for the most part it's quite a bit of havoc. I'd say just because of the defense lowering and the ability for him to lock people in place, which causes a huge amount of havoc in a lot of fights, I think Rildo is definitely harder than Cooler, and I'm going to place him up there. He's definitely a step above Cooler. Personally speaking, I think he's 100% harder than Cooler, not like double as hard, but he's definitely a harder unit to fight than Cooler. Then we have, back to Redzone, we have Fusion Android 13. So Fusion Android 13 is one of those ones that I don't find as hard as some people found him. So Fusion Android 13, obviously the big deal with Fusion Android 13 is that, you know, he disables evasion. This would be a huge issue, I believe, if, well, one, some of the best units that counter him were in tech, like, you know, God Goku, and B, if he didn't have 2 AGL phases in a row. So not only is there no int unit in the first phase that takes out, or prevents you from running a full tech team, but you can pretty much run a full tech team and just stun lock his 2 cronies in the first phase and get through that phase fine. Both of them hit a little bit harder than Cooler's units, and they have a decent amount of health, but they can be stunned, which is obviously quite crucial. Not to mention, you can run, like I said, a full tech team. So immediately once you get through their phase, you're basically running the rest of the event with full type advantage. Some people might think that makes it sound really easy. It's obviously not easy. He hits very hard, 742,000 super attack damage on the first phase of Android 13, 900,000 on the second phase. The thing is, though, if you have tech units and you are running a full tech team, you can kind of obviously work around them to a certain extent. The ability to soak up damage with units like Movie God Goku. There's a lot of good tech options with the Super Saiyan God units, Gogeta, Movie God Goku. There's just very strong tech teams, and it's something that I'm going to talk about when we get to Broly, but generally speaking, I don't think Android 13 is as tough due to the fact that there are so many good tech options. Some people might say that, some people might question that, but I genuinely think that Super 13 is maybe as hard as Rildo. Maybe. Right now I'm going to keep Rildo above him, but I definitely think Super 13 is maybe as hard as Rildo. We'll stick them together for now, but I definitely think Super 13, yeah, he just struggles with that double AGL round. It's just very bad. Like that kind of thing immediately spoils a unit. Then we come to Super 17 on the GT side. Are we good? No, we're baby now, sorry. Come to baby. Baby's very hard. So baby does exactly what I just said for Android 13. They have a double int phase, and this is something that's going to count against him. But what they do really well with baby is that final phase is very intense. So the first phase is obviously against Tech Baby. Tech Baby is an absolute menace to the Ginyu team. I think I failed like 2 runs just in the first 30 seconds because I had to bank on Captain Ginyu taking a super attack from Tech Baby, and it just absolutely blew his brains out. 562,000 SA damage, obviously a very big issue, but he also lowers attack and defense, which is pretty nutty for a boss to do. Again, this lowering defense really impacts units that rely on raw defense a lot. So that's a big issue. Then we have AGL, Baby 2. He ramps it up to 672 in SA damage, but loses the attack and defense lowering. Then you go to the int phase against Super Vegeta, and then very similar story, very similar to the AGL phase. And then you come to the Great Ape Baby phase, and that Great Ape Baby phase does 990,000 damage on its SA, which also stuns your unit, and he also can do AoE normal attacks. Now AoE normal attacks don't hit hard, but they do when they are 313,000 attack. So it does cause you some problems. Generally speaking, again with the double int phase, physical based teams tend to do quite well, and his direct counter is obviously the GT Heroes units, who can run some pretty strong physical units on their team. Physical Gogeta, the Super Saiyan, obviously Goku and Vegeta Angel unit that transforms. You've got obviously them themselves, you've got the GT Goku as well. So you have some really strong physical units, and if you can get through the first 2 phases, it's actually genuinely quite in control. Just because the SS4 Gogeta units will then take over the fight quite badly and really kind of tear through Baby very quickly. Obviously the AoE attacks cause you a problem, but when you're running a almost near full physical team, you generally don't have that big problem. But I think Baby does pose a big issue, very similarly to Broly, because of the AoE factor. And the AoE factor always causes a problem because it requires your whole team, in a sense, to be strong with start of turn defense, whereas a lot of strong units will gain their defense at least on super or a large portion, or dramatically raise it. So he does pose a big problem. Right now we're going to stick him at 4th, because I do think he does pose quite a big issue. Then we are going to be looking at Bojack. So Bojack is a very, very public menace. He is a huge threat to society. He is causing a lot of people a lot of headaches. And I think the reason being is, I mentioned it when I was taking him on, but he removes player agency quite substantially, which I think people don't like. You know, the first phase, all of his cronies are immune to stunning. It's very different from the other phases where you could stun units and kind of keep control of them. They're also relatively quite tough. They all have decent amount of health, and they're all starting to hit that over 500,000 mark, which I think poses quite a big issue for a lot of people. Then in terms of, like, you know, the next phase against Bojack, he immediately ramps it up. He's doing 850,000 supers, and he also in his in phase changes orbs, which isn't that big of an issue, but it's a precursor to his next phase. And then his final phase, he randomly changes key spheres and locks character switching, and will randomly seal one character at the start of turn. It's a very big issue, because you'll find a lot of units that need super to gain their defense, and when they can't super to gain their defense, they are in absolute trouble. So that's a very big issue, actually, and I think Bojack can be a little bit underrated in the scheme of things. Me personally, I have him 3rd. I think the final phase against Bojack is very, very tough. If not one of the toughest phases in the game. He's got a lot of health, he's got a lot of annoying factors with him, and I think he can pose a lot of teams a lot of problems. I also think, unlike some of the other phases, they do a good job. They do counter in-team to a large extent in the first phase, and I think Bojack hits so hard to the point that you can't just bring full in-teams. I also think right now int is a little bit weak. I think int's a little bit weak at this point. So it's just a little, I think int's a little bit weak. So I think that also plays into this a little bit, comparatively to some of the other categories. I think int is lacking. Majin Vegeta is very good, his leader skill is pretty decent, but I do think a lot of the units on Vegeta's family that aren't Super Saiyan 4 or Strength Vegeta, and a lot of units that are on there, like AGL Trunks is very good, but he's facing a tech type Bojack, so I think that causes him quite a few problems. And then, obviously we move on to Super 17. So Super 17 posed a lot of people a lot of problems. I'm going to be honest. So all of these bosses I've taken on twice. Super 17 was the easiest both times, because his first phase is tough, but it's really not impossible. Both of the 17s hit pretty hard, but if you do a stacking team or a team that has guard, you can generally get past them quite easily. And then Super 17 is just this big strength kind of dump of health, and he does hit super hard. His super attacks hit for like 1 million, which is pretty rough. I don't think anyone can deny how rough that is. Also, the key negation factor is quite challenging. If AGL wasn't full of units that basically stopped basically manhandled, just did physical attacks. There's like a ton of great AGL physical based units. I obviously, for the run I used on my channel, I used the Ginyu Force. Obviously, Captain Ginyu rips through Super 17. That's not a surprise. AGL Planet Namek Frieza also rips through him. Does a lot of damage. But, you know, even units like Kamehameha, AGL Team Gohan, SS4 Goku, all of their attacks are actually physical attacks because they start them off with punches and kicks. So, you know, all of those units are able to really tear through Super 17. And for that reason, I'm going to place him 5th. He's tough. He's definitely tough. But I just think he is lacking with how short the changeover is, and with the fact that there's no counter to AGL in the first phase. I think popping your items and getting through the first phase with an AGL team really sets you up to take the second phase quite easily. You just have to be very careful about active skills in that, but generally speaking, it's quite comfortable to build a full AGL team with physical based attacks. So yeah. Then we obviously have Janemba. So Janemba's tough. Janemba is tough. The thing with Janemba is you are going to be fighting the Int Janemba for a very, 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 very brief period of time. So you can bring a very high level of strength into this fight. Strength-based fights also very good. Tech units are also very good. Like when I took on the run, you'll notice I used Power Beyond Super Saiyan. I actually used tech units in there because you are facing the Int phase for such a brief period of time. There's very little, I want to say there's very little reason, but there's no need to be too alarmed of it. Because he takes 6 attacks. With the amount of multiple attacks that Tech God Boys throw, you're going to be past this guy in an instant. He changes orbs, which isn't like the worst mechanic. I think nowadays so many units have key generating abilities that it's really not that big a deal. And evasion still works against him. And evasion works quite well against him. So even though he hits hard, like he hits on parity with Super 17, around that level of damage, I just feel like if you can get through the first phase, generally with your team quite intact, without having taken too much damage and with having at least one item, you can generally set up quite well for the remainder of the content. His dodges can be somewhat irritating, but he's only got a 10% dodge chance. And yeah, just generally speaking, I don't know, I just didn't find him that difficult. He was hard. When I say not that difficult, he was definitely hard, but I think he's probably as tough as Super 17. I think if you're having issues with Super 17, you could find yourself having very similar issues with Janemba. And yeah, I think that's generally where I'd probably let it lie. Then of course, we now move on to we move on to Shadow Dragons. So Shadow Dragons is a stage that I feel is underestimated a lot. So the Shadow Dragons can generally be quite a nuisance, but it's because of the length of time. So your chance and the type changing, your chance of taking or catching a stray super at some point is always the big issue with Shadow Dragons. It's really not so much that they are incredibly tough. It's that they can really catch you off guard. The first 3 phases are all very roughly the same, which allows you time to set up, which I think is the greatest weakness of this event. They don't really scale between phase 1, 2, and 3. So the first fight will be very tough for you, or generally tougher. And then once your team is stacked or built up, or your rotations are set, generally the second phase and third phase are not that big an issue. Once you've completed those phases, it then takes another big step up to Shenron, but you should generally be okay for that as well. So it allows you a lot of time to ramp up, and I think that's what makes it different to some of the other phases. Each boss has their gimmick, the second phase, Rage Shenron, he nullifies Ki Blast, but he doesn't absorb them for health, so you can actually use them to stack defense, which is a terrible strategy, but you can do it. Oceanus randomly changes Ki Spheres again, it's not that big of an issue. There's a 40% chance for Shenron to seal Nova Shenron can evade, and then Ice Shenron locks character switching. But it's not like Bojack or Omega Shenron where all these things happen at the same time. I actually, gotta be honest, it's more just tough through length. I think these, when it's like a 25-minute fight, just to get to the end, it's always going to be quite a challenge. So I'm going to stick them probably here. I think they are as tough as Lord Slug and Lud. I think they're technically easier, or I mean they're technically harder in terms of mass, but I think the ramp up time really lets you kind of take a stacking team and handle things quite comfortably if you're willing to go at a slower pace. And then we get to the two big boys, so we get to Broly and we get to Omega Shenron. So right off the bat, Omega Shenron is going to be a unit that either causes you issues or doesn't. So the first phase of Omega Shenron is quite challenging. He can seal a unit and he can lock them in place and he can change your orbs and he can stun your units. Once you get through that first phase, a lot of that falls away and he just only changes orbs. So not that that immediately diminishes him, but generally speaking, if you get through the first phase, you've kind of removed a lot of his gimmicks, which I'm not saying is like a bad thing, but I just think, when you remove a lot of a unit's gimmicks like that, I feel like it kind of diminishes the abject strength of the boss. I genuinely feel like Omega Shenron is harder in his first phase. I know that might sound really, really, really weird to say, but I genuinely feel like he's harder in his first phase than the rest of his fight because he loses a lot of those control denying activities, and I think those cause you some issues. And then he kind of immediately gives you a huge amount of control back by letting you see pretty much when his super attack happens. So I don't know. Omega Shenron, for me, he's up there because he hits very hard out of the gate, but I just don't feel like... I feel like they missed a trick with him, and they should have made him not have the full kind of diminishing control that he needs to have through like the whole fight, but give some back to him. Or let him at least stun, or have a chance to stun on a normal or something. I just think it's, he loses way too much control mechanics, and then the fight progressively becomes easier for me. Bring a physical team, get through the strength phase, and you should be fine. I brought the Ginyu team for one of my runs, and then I brought a Hybrid Saiyans physical based team and a Fused Fighters team for my second and third run, and both of them handled them fine. I actually genuinely just used items on the second phase, and because of the ability to foresee where the super attack was coming, I could generally just soak up the damage for the rest of the fight. He does hit notably hard, obviously his infamous 1.5 million attack stat on his super attack, but I actually kind of almost want to do this, just because I feel like, even here, I feel like these two posed me more issues than Omega Shenron, just because of the way you can handle Omega Shenron. For me personally, some people would disagree, but I think that's where I want to place him. And then obviously Broly comes to the top. The reason Broly is at the top is not because I feel like he's ostensibly way harder than the other units. Broly is at the top because his third phase is the most obnoxious thing in existence and requires you to at least always use one item, or sometimes even two items, and that then leaves you on thin ice for the remainder of the fight. Now Broly will be completely almost made redundant by upcoming tech units because Broly is that way inclined. Broly's very different to a lot of other bosses. Broly's design is essentially to be incinerated. So Broly is designed to be absolutely massacred, and the Power Beyond Super Saiyan team does do this very, very well. The big issue you face is that 800,000 AoE attack. A super attack that has 850,000 damage poses a lot of issues, and I don't think it's anything people can kind of get around. Now, you can take the first phase quite easily with stunning, which is always nice. I think it's good that they do that, so you can kind of write off the first phase, but remember you have no evasion. And for me, that's what makes Broly so difficult, is that he completely locks out a big mechanic to a lot of units' defense. So a lot of units rely on evasion to get through fights with their defense capabilities, and so he immediately just causes a huge amount of issues for so many units because they cannot dodge. Even the Ginyu team, for example, like Int, Jason, Berta, which are a unit that are a premier unit for every other stage, you need to have like 3 dupes in to be able to take on the Broly event, because all of a sudden their raw defense just cannot handle it and their evasion does not count at all. Something that helps against Broly is obviously the ability to foresee super attacks. The Gogeta is a premier unit that's used here, and you'll notice that a lot of people are using the same team to take out Broly, and that's because it is just a very good team. That is one thing. There is kind of an elite specialist team that does take out Broly. It does have very top tier units in it, but once you have those units, or even have those units at 55% or with just 1 dupe and some of them, you can generally take them out. And that's just because the Super Saiyan God units, the Goku and the Vegeta, absolutely incinerate Broly. But I mean, it's kind of designed like that, isn't it? You know, the Goku and Vegeta GT take out Omega Shenron, and the God Boys take out Broly. Kind of makes sense, you know, if you think about it. But yeah, I think this will be my tier list. I'm pretty happy with where everything is. I think if I could make a slight adjustment, I would probably, I'm gonna probably leave the top 4. I'll maybe put like this, and then I will probably go like this, and then I will put Android 13 here, and then I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. I find Bojack to be quite fun, so yeah, I think if I do this, I think I'm happy. A lot of people will probably disagree, but I think, yeah, if I had to count up the amount of attempts it took me, it probably followed something along those lines. Although weirdly enough, it did actually probably take me more attempts for Baby. But that was because I was trying a lot of alternate teams on Baby to see how everything would handle. But yeah, I think that's pretty good. And yeah, hope you enjoy the video. Yeah, long one. But hey, there we go. So cheers and bye.